Hi everyone! This video is all about Patron. I will be sharing my story with it, how I started and how I closed it only after 1 year and a couple of months. I think this is something everyone thinking about opening their own Patron account should watch. I will try to be very objective. I think Patron is a lovely company. I also like supporting artists myself there. But my idea is to tell you my story and also give you some ideas of alternatives for those of you who also are looking for some ways to gain some more income on the side. If you are new to this channel, my name is Asia Orlando. I'm a digital artist and illustrator, and I'm also the founder of our Planet Week movement, which is an event to bring some more awareness to environmental issues with our illustration. On my YouTube channel, I talk about illustration, art, and resources for creatives. If you hear some weird noises through the video, this is my dog next to me playing with her toys. So let's get started. I opened my Patreon account early in 2020, and since the very beginning I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to share there. And I also wanted to keep a very good balance between my free and open content here on YouTube and my closed and paid community on Patreon. My YouTube channel you're watching right now is all about illustration. I also share my work on my Instagram account, and so I wanted to make my Patreon all about illustration as a business and profession. So in this video I'm not gonna be talking about my Patreon because I don't have it anymore, but I will share with you my experience and how it all went. Patron was my idea to build a corner full of practical advice and hands-on experience for creatives aspiring to become professional illustrators. For those of you who are just entering the illustration world, where we can talk about stuff like dealing with clients, project management, presenting our work, building our portfolio and stuff like that. So, in a way, for you to be able to make a living as an artist. I wanted to make my Patreon a place where we can talk about pricing, different types of illustration jobs, licensing, help you to build your portfolio and also help you to find and attract new clients. So on my Patreon I was making videos documenting how I was working on my different illustration projects, how I was implementing my clients' feedback, different stages of those projects. I also wanted to show you some more practical and business side of illustration, and so I also started a podcast, and on my Patreon I was also including many speed paints of my works. All of those things I wasn't sharing anywhere else, so they were exclusively dedicated for my patrons. Something important to mention is that Patreon supporters are very used to receiving art content from artists, and I noticed I was expected to teach only how to illustrate. Since the very beginning of my Patreon, my intention was never to make art tutorials, art videos, art classes, teach you how to paint, illustrate or draw, and I made it very clear. But even so, something that was happening a lot were people joining my Patreon and leaving very promptly as they were expecting to find their content such as art tutorials or art videos. By the way, I'll be soon releasing my first illustration class where I teach you how to illustrate, so stay tuned. I will just quickly tell you that the reason why I wanted to focus my Patreon on the business side of illustration is that when I was starting out as a freelance independent illustrator, this is the kind of content that I needed the most and it was nowhere to be found. I came across some business advice, of course, but it couldn't really be applied to what we as creatives do. Very few creatives talk about artist-clients dynamics, good business approach, and creating art successfully to be able to make a living out of it. So in short, I wanted to make my Patreon a space for creatives focused to make art their career. Another goal of mine on Patreon was to build a small community. Both YouTube and Instagram are great, but there are both publicly open spaces that anyone can access. And so I really wanted to share some more non-art related things, live updates, chat with you in a more intimate group, which is something that I'm not always comfortable doing on my YouTube or Instagram account. Overall, more than 500 patrons passed by my account, but sadly I've noticed that most of them would consume all the content I uploaded there, would download the free resources I was offering, like for example my Procreate brushes or wallpapers, and then afterwards they would just cancel the pledge. For over a year I was observing how the amount of content I managed to upload each month didn't really impact the number of patrons that would pledge for 1 month and then just cancel the tier. Now, it's very important you don't get me wrong, because this is of course every patron's right and there's nothing wrong with it, but for me as a creator it presented a challenge, as in some way I felt I was failing to keep my patrons engaged. Just so you know, my Patreon revenue at the time was about 200 euros, which for some might be a lot, but I think in comparison to all the time, work and time I put into it is not enough. Also, as you can imagine, having a constantly changing flow of short-term contributors made it really hard for me to connect with my patrons as a community, which was definitely something I was looking forwards to. This is also something I think everyone should think about before starting their Patreon, and now I will talk about some alternatives. What I learned about Patreon. Patreon is a platform that definitely takes loads of your time to build and maintain. There are creators who dedicate fully to create Patreon content as a way of living, or creatives for whom creating content for Patreon is a big chunk of their business. But in my case, for example, a lot of my professional time goes into client work or creating free content here on YouTube, or for example, right now in my newsletter. It was definitely hard to maintain my Patreon while also being everywhere else. I also felt a lot of self-imposed pressure whenever I wasn't able to upload as much content as I wanted to due to my client work. One of the most important things I experience with my Patreon is that online subscription-based platforms have a high rotation, meaning people who come in most cases don't intend to stay for a long time. In case of Patreon, you can support a tier for a month, in that time consume all the content ever produced by the artist, and after that time leave for a price of 1 month. As a creator, if you want people to join your Patreon, you have to talk about it constantly, advertising it as much as you can and wherever you can, sometimes even too much. And for that to be successful, you already need to have a significant community built. I think it's also important to mention that from the money standpoint, the revenue from Patreon wasn't significant enough for the amount of time and work I put to maintain my Patreon community. Creating a video for 40 patrons takes the same time of preparation and effort as it does when you make it for thousands and thousands of YouTubers. So what did I do? After closing my Patreon, I started a free newsletter called Creative Draft. It's open to everyone, you can join at any time, and I share their free resources for artists and creatives, book recommendations, events, helpful publications, anything that can be significant and useful for us artists. I will leave for you the link where you can join. You can unsubscribe for any time, so it's no pressure for you, but also it's no pressure for me, as I know that whenever I'm swamped with client work, my newsletter will just arrive a week or two later, and it's not a problem. Also, I'm very sorry about the light changes. It's getting darker at 3 p.m. now. To teach you some illustration, share my tips and advice about it, I've been working very hard on my illustration online class, coming your way very, very soon. You can also count on me being very present here on YouTube and on my Instagram account, so I invite you to follow me. So let me share with you some final observations and lessons I learned with Patron. In my experience, Patron is a platform that won't work for everyone, especially if you are starting out. There are of course artists who do great on Patron, but in most cases those are creators with thousands and thousands and thousands of followers like Loish or Franerd. They, however, seem to be more the exception than the rule. So I think that if you are a starting out artist, you should make sure that a big part of your community is honestly thinking about joining you on Patreon, and you can test the water a little bit by, for example, opening a Ko-fi account, start free newsletter or a Discord server. This way you could, for example, check how many people are willing to support the free resources or free content you are already making. And having a newsletter, for example, could be like a small Patreon where you share things with your audience, and you could easily see how many people are willing to connect with you that way and would like to receive notifications from you. So that's it. I hope the video was useful and shed some light if you are considering creating your own Patreon account. The idea behind Patreon is great. I like supporting artists over there. I think it's a great opportunity for us to learn from each other and support each other. I'd love to hear your opinion about Patreon, and please share your experience in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to like the video, and I see you in the next one. Bye!